What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The night my life took a hard left did not arrive with thunder or a sky split open by drama. It walked in wearing polite shoes, carrying a casserole, and pretending to be normal, and I remember thinking, as I set the table and smoothed the wrinkles out of the napkins, that maybe this was what forgiveness looked like in the wild. A little stiff, a little awkward, but technically alive. Because my brother Ethan had insisted we all sit together like civilized people and reset, and my husband, Daniel, said he wanted peace, and Maya, my brother's wife, smiled that pageant smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I, like a fool with a calendar, penciled hope between the salad and the roast. I planned the menu like a peace treaty and measured the timing down to the minute, because when a family is a cracked window you learn to close doors gently, and I told myself that if we could get through one meal without complaints, gossip, or the sort of compliments that are really insults in a cocktail dress, then maybe we could build on that, plank by plank, and I could stop waking at 3 in the morning doing the math on our mortgage while replaying every clipped sentence Daniel had said in the past 6 months, as if the right arrangement might suddenly start making sense. Ethan arrived first with wine he could not afford and opinions no one requested, dropping both on my counter like he was entitled to watch me clean them up, and Maya followed with her perfect posture and that tiny gold cross that managed to look like a brand. And Daniel came in last, apologizing to the doormat because he had gotten used to apologizing to the wrong things, and for the first half hour I performed the dance of pleasant hosting while keeping count of everyone's glances the way you count cards in a game you never wanted to play, and if you think that sounds paranoid, you have never tried to share a dining room with a secret that keeps clearing its throat. We sat, we passed plates, we traded small talk like counterfeit bills, and my mother's advice, which sounds sweet until you live with it, rang in my head about how families survive on polite lies, and I thought, fine. I will lie that the roast is perfect and that I do not notice the static buzzing between the two people sitting across from me like a power line too close to water. But then Maya laughed at something Daniel said, not too loud and not too long. Just the way people laugh when they have already practiced the sound in private, and the air in that room pressed closer to my skin, and I realized I was the only person at that table still pretending to be surprised by anything. When the dessert came out, Ethan raised his glass and delivered a toast about new beginnings with the confidence of a man who has never cleaned up his own mess, and Daniel's hand found the stem of his glass the way a man reaches for the first excuse within reach. And Maya watched him with the concentration of someone guiding a drone over restricted airspace, and I, who once believed the solution to every problem was more effort, looked at my brother and asked, very calmly, which beginning he meant, the one where he started advising my husband about what I really needed, or the one where my husband started taking that advice in the middle of the afternoon in hotel rooms with better lighting than our marriage. And the room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator sigh like it was tired of us. Ethan blustered, as he always does when the truth turns the lights on, saying I was misreading things and that I had been stressed and maybe a little uptight, and that he had only ever wanted to help Daniel feel understood. Which is the kind of sentence men use when they want credit for not being worse, and Daniel, who used to grip my hand under the table when my father said something unfair, stared at his plate like the answer might be hiding under a blueberry. And Maya reached across the table for a napkin that did not need straightening, and I watched her fingers, elegant and practiced, handling fabric the way I imagined they had learned to handle my husband's doubts and timing and heartbeat, and I thought, how sad to be this good at dressing a wound you helped open. I did not scream, because screaming gives everyone else an easy excuse to label you the problem. I poured water, I set my glass down, and I told them that if this was a misunderstanding it could be cleared by 3 simple truths spoken in a row. And I would go first, because I am not afraid of truth when it burns, and I said I have been lonely in my own house, I have felt eyes on my husband that were not mine, and I have been collecting the little receipts people think do not count, like the matching billing address on a hotel rewards account, and the way my brother suddenly learned the code to my husband's phone, and then I asked Daniel to try 3 truths of his own. Daniel's mouth worked like a door with a swollen frame, and in the gap between what he wanted to say and what he could not deny, Maya stood up to help collect plates that were not ready to be cleared. Which is when a small hotel key card slid out from under her phone and kissed the hardwood with a sound no one at that table will ever forget, and Ethan lunged for it like a lifeguard chasing a cigarette on a windy beach, and I, who used to worry I was overreacting, simply watched gravity do the kind of delicate work it was made for. There was a moment when no one breathed, which felt honest, and then Daniel said my name the way people say a password they know has already expired, and he started talking about being confused and lost and how it just happened, which is something broken adults say when they want to describe choices as weather, and Maya asked me to be kind because we all make mistakes, and Ethan, who considered himself the family's fixer, put a hand on my shoulder like the manager of someone else's apology, and said, "You'll thank me one day," and the fork in my hand suddenly weighed as much as a gavel. I set it down, I wiped the table as if I were erasing a chalkboard, and I told them that kindness is not the same as financing other people's bad decisions, and that I would not be the contractor hired to rebuild a house they had set on fire for the thrill of watching the flames dance. And when Daniel stood, red-eyed and guilty and still somehow offended, and Maya gathered her bag, and Ethan held the door as if chivalry could launder betrayal, I did not stop them walking into the night together. I did not chase the car, I did not perform grief for an audience that preferred their tragedies neat. What I did, after the taillights disappeared and the house exhaled what was left of our old life, was open the drawer where we kept warranties and spare batteries, pull out the folder labeled taxes and other things that hurt, and take a long, steady look at the paper trail no one had bothered to hide, because people who think they are winning forget that the game keeps records, and while the dishwasher hummed like a polite witness, I found a name I did not expect to see linked to an account it did not belong to, and that was the first breadcrumb on a path none of them saw coming, the one that would lead, sooner than they imagined, to a hospital bed and a bill with a very specific forwarding address. By Sunday afternoon, the group text had done what group texts always do in families that think optics are a moral compass. It had turned a disaster into a potluck. So I walked into my parents' living room carrying a casserole I did not intend to eat and a folder I very much intended to open, and I took in the scene with the detached attention you use at an airport gate when you have already accepted the delay. Because my mother had lined up folding chairs like a church basement seminar, my father had positioned himself at the head of the coffee table as if this were a budget meeting and not a reckoning, and Ethan, draped across the sofa with the doomed confidence of a man who has never met a consequence he could not charm, whispered something to Maya that made her lipstick smile hold a little longer than necessary, while Daniel, perched on the edge of a piano bench, looked like a man trying to act like a guest in a life he had once owned. My mother opened with a prayer that tried to negotiate with reality, and then launched into a speech about unity, about how marriages break sometimes and siblings should not, and how the righteous thing would be to find a way through this without ruining Thanksgiving. And if that sounds like a punchline, you have never had a parent-grade betrayal on a holiday curve. So I let her finish and took the floor with the quiet that scares people more than yelling, and I said I came to make 3 things clear. First, that I am not a grenade you all need to tiptoe around. Second, that there are facts that do not become rude just because we say them out loud. And third, that I am finished financing other people's narratives. And then I opened my folder the way you open an umbrella you bought for storms, exactly like this. I laid out copies the way a dealer lays cards in a game where the rules are finally going to matter. Receipts that threaded from Daniel's company card to boutique charges and hotel stays that did not coincide with any trade shows. Line items in a QuickBooks export where consulting kept appearing next to my brother's Shell LLC. Screenshots of a rewards account that cheerfully aggregated points earned while I was at home trying to keep our mortgage on time. And I did not look at Daniel first, because mercy starts by not making a person watch their own face. I looked at Ethan and asked whether he wanted to explain why his name appeared as an authorized user on a business card he had never earned, and whether the forged signature on the vendor onboarding form was his idea or just his handwriting's bad habit. Ethan laughed in that way where the sound goes up, but the eyes go flat. A politician's chuckle pasted over a schoolboy's panic, and he talked about misunderstandings and how he had only fronted a few charges while Daniel was between cards, and that any overlap with personal spending was a clerical error. And then, sensing the room's drift, he pivoted to blame, suggesting I had grown cold, controlling, maybe a little punitive, and Daniel, seizing the lifeline, mumbled that he had felt invisible, and my mother, who hates specifics the way cats hate water, pleaded that we stop dragging money into love because it never ends well. And I almost laughed because love had been dragged into money the moment someone swiped a piece of plastic on a bed that was not ours. So I kept my tone level and my sentences longer than their excuses, and I explained, for the benefit of the elders and the innocent furniture, that what bothered me more than sex was paperwork. That betrayal of the body is messy, but betrayal of the ledger is deliberate. It requires names and dates and boxes checked next to statements that carry penalties and interest. And then I set down the document that mattered most to me, a copy of a personal guarantee I had signed years earlier to help Daniel secure a small line of credit when we were still building a life, and I believed in the project of us, as if belief were collateral. And next to it I placed a notarized revocation, effective Friday, removing my name from any renewal and notifying the bank that any future draw would be considered outside the scope of my consent. And I told my father, clearly and without apology, that I was not going to let my credit score be strapped into this roller coaster for the amusement of two adults who thought the lap bar was optional. Silence followed, not the holy kind, the calculating kind, the kind where people avoid eye contact because arithmetic is happening behind their faces, and my mother reached for the familiar script about forgiveness again, this time sprinkling in words like grace and family discount, and I nodded because grace is a lovely word until it becomes a coupon for repeat offenders, and I said I had already done my part for grace by not bringing a lawyer to this bake sale, but I would be doing something else by sundown that might not feel like forgiveness, but would sound a lot like accountability, and Daniel asked what that meant in a voice that confused dread with curiosity. I told him it meant I would be filing a simple, perfectly legal conflict of interest complaint with his company's compliance officer, attaching the vendor forms and the overlapping billing addresses, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because if there is one thing I learned from marriage, it is that secrets metabolize into debts, and I would rather the balance be calculated now while everyone is still sitting upright. And it also meant, I said while sliding a small padded envelope to Ethan, that I was returning the spare keys to the lake house he loved to post on social media, along with a printed excerpt from the Homeowner Association bylaws highlighting the section on short-term rentals and unapproved structural changes. And I had already emailed the board the photo of his weekend renovation with the caption he had written himself, bragging about the new deck he built, without permits, because permits are for people who read instructions, and perhaps, I added with a touch of tired humor, he should read a few now. Maya exhaled like a balloon meeting a pin. My father rubbed his temple the way he used to when the transmission went on the old sedan. My mother muttered about airing laundry in front of the Lord, and I stood, collected my folder, and told them I wished them all health, that I would no longer be available for spin control, and that I hoped no one mistook my boundary for cruelty, because the only thing I had cut off today was the pipeline between my back and their knives. And then I left my casserole on the counter, because someone should get nourishment out of this day, even if it was just starch. At 9 that evening, as I sorted old birthday cards and the house relearned its shape without extra voices in it, my phone lit with a number I knew by heart and a desperation I recognized immediately. And Ethan's voice came through thin and pressed like someone speaking through a paper bag, asking whether I had touched anything at the bank because his corporate card had just been declined at a gas station on the interstate, and the lender had left a message about updated guarantees and temporary holds pending review. And I looked at the folder on my table, at the notarized stamp catching the lamplight, and answered with the softness you use when you refuse a second slice, telling him I had simply returned to each of us what belonged to us. Then I wished him a good night, ended the call, and listened to the quiet for a long breath before the second call of the night began to ring with an area code I did not recognize and a voicemail transcription that opened with the words, "Compliance inquiry regarding submitted documentation," which, even before I pressed play, felt like the first domino moving. The week after the compliance call felt like a storm pretending to be weather, not a single dramatic clap of thunder to point at, just pressure, low and steady, sliding under doors and through vents. And I watched from the calmest chair in my house as the news traveled through the channels men like my brother think they control, the banker with the careful voice who leaves messages referencing routine reviews while quietly tightening valves, the vendor who suddenly requires payment upon delivery instead of 30 days net, the client who asks for a revised W-9 because their new accountant is cleaning up files, and each request arrived with the same polite undertone that always precedes a reckoning, the one that says, without saying it, "We met your charm and would now like to see your documents, please." Daniel, because habit dies slower than love, sent a long text at dawn asking if I had meant to copy him on an email to his compliance officer, which I had not, because I had filed my complaint properly and privately, yet there it was. A forwarded chain with attachments and timestamps, and the kind of precision that makes liars nostalgic for chaos. And as he tried to spin his way into innocence, I remembered the years I had spent editing his apologies for grammar instead of content and understood that nothing grows in soil that's shallow, so I answered in one long sentence explaining that I was not his editor, nor his alibi, and that the audit he feared was simply a mirror refusing to fog when he breathed on it. Ethan, however, never learned to read mirrors, so he kept sprinting between fires holding a glass of water and a can of gasoline, calling me between meetings to accuse me of sabotage and then, in the same breath, asking whether I thought a temporary bridge loan from the family might calm things down, and I resisted the urge to laugh because humor is gasoline too, and instead I told him he had an optics problem that only truth could fix. Then I hung up and returned to my actual work, which at that point included a quick, tidy project of mine titled Removing the Magic Coupons. A task accomplished with a few calm phone calls to rewards programs and travel portals that had been racking up points under my household profile while I was home doing the unglamorous arithmetic of real life. And I asked the agent to split the accounts by legal address and beneficiary, which they did with admirable efficiency, and the next day Ethan discovered that the soft perks propping up his hard image had vanished like confetti after a parade the street has to sweep. Maya, who had always treated consequences like rumors that would never be confirmed, texted me a polite paragraph about how stressful this all was and how perhaps we could meet for coffee to move past the accounting ugliness. And I reread her punctuation before answering, because punctuation reveals agenda better than perfume. Then I declined with a note as even as a metronome, telling her I preferred written records for all future communications, and I added, as a courtesy and a kindness I would never be thanked for, that posting photos of the unpermitted deck in peak season was not helping her insurance claim from last spring, and that I had forwarded, at the board's request, the contractor's invoice she had tried to pass off as landscaping. And it struck me, not without sadness, that my most effective revenge continued to be nothing more exotic than literacy. In the middle of that quiet campaign, I did one last thing that felt small as I did it and very large when it bloomed, which was to send a single email to the regional buyer for the restaurant chain that accounted for half of Ethan's catering revenue. A woman named Grace whom I had met once at a holiday tasting, and I wrote to her from my personal account, not anonymous, not theatrical, simply factual, attaching the public compliance notice that Daniel's firm had been obligated to issue once. Their review opened, and I asked, with the exact softness of someone declining a second slice of cake, whether her contracts required vendors to disclose potential conflicts that could affect fulfillment. And because Grace's job title had the word risk in it, and because women with that word in their title rarely ignore receipts, she replied within the hour to thank me and say that, effective immediately, they would be pausing new purchase orders until documentation was supplied, which is how a single seed of truth toppled the trellis Ethan had been climbing for years like it owed him shade. The calls that followed came rapid and sweaty, a relay race of voices trying to pin their short breath on my long sentences, my mother pleading for a ceasefire because she wanted her boys to work it out, my father growling about family name and public embarrassment as if the embarrassment were a crime committed by the witness, Daniel asking for time to fix misalignments, like ethics were a shelf you leveled with coasters, and Ethan leaving a voice message in which he promised to make this right if I would just stop sending things, and in that phrase lived the whole problem, because he still believed rightness was a negotiation and not a return to the truth with late fees attached. My revenge that day, the one I promised myself at the end of every segment of this slow demolition, was simple and deeply satisfying, a mercy wrapped like a barb. I sent Ethan, by certified mail with signature required, a tidy packet titled Accounts You May Have Forgotten, containing a step-by-step plan to unwind the mess in the least expensive order, beginning with payroll taxes and ending with a script for calling Grace that would at least keep the door from slamming shut. And I included a handwritten note that said, in a tone our mother would have approved of, that grown adults do not lose clients because their sisters breathe. They lose clients because their numbers do not add up. And by offering him a path he could take or ignore, I gave myself the cleanest victory available, because nothing is sharper than a choice offered to someone who prefers tricks. Near midnight, when the windows cooled and the refrigerator hummed like a tired witness, my phone lit with Maya's name, and the message arrived in uneven chunks the way texts do when hands are shaking, telling me that Ethan had stormed out after a screaming match about respect and contracts, and who had ever truly built anything, that he had taken the car with the headlights off as if darkness were a disguise, and that she had tried to stop him because there had been drinks and he was furious, and the highway does not negotiate with fury. And as I stared at the screen I felt no triumph, only the particular stillness of a hush before metal learns a hard lesson, and then, pressing against that stillness, came a new number and a short ring and a pause so long the house seemed to lean in, and a voice I did not recognize began with my name and the words, "We need a family contact," and everything in me understood that karma had chosen its route and was now, with terrible courtesy, asking for directions. The phone call that night did not sound like panic at first. It sounded like static wearing a human voice, a nurse with the tone of someone trained to keep her sentences even while the world on the other end unravels, saying my brother's name, saying the word accident, and asking if I could confirm that I was next of kin, and in that moment the entire house seemed to pause as if the walls themselves were listening for my answer. I remember staring at the corner of the kitchen table where Daniel's coffee stain had never quite come out, and thinking how strange it was that something as catastrophic as fate could arrive through such ordinary furniture. She explained there had been a single-car collision just outside the county line, that weather and alcohol were both suspected factors, that emergency responders had found him conscious but incoherent, and that he was now in critical care awaiting surgery for internal bleeding. I asked the questions that trained voices expect: how bad, how long, is he stable, and she gave answers that sounded like holding your breath underwater, brief and uncertain. By the time I reached the hospital, my parents were already there, two statues carved from worry and denial. My mother was praying with her hands clenched so tight the knuckles had turned the color of chalk, and my father sat hunched forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the floor tiles as if numbers might form there to balance what could never be accounted for. When they saw me, my mother's face shifted into that reflexive expression of hope, the same one she used when I was a child coming home with a school report, as though good grades could still fix bad behavior. She whispered that they were short on funds, that the hospital required an upfront payment for the surgery, and that perhaps, given everything, I could put the past aside and help until the insurance sorted itself out. I stood there in that sterile hallway, surrounded by the antiseptic hum of machines and the muffled sobs of other families, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the full weight of irony settle on my shoulders. Here was the man who had borrowed without asking, lied without blinking, and stolen without shame, now lying in a bed that cost more per hour than the sum of all his apologies, and the same people who had defended him through every deceit were now turning to me. the supposed ice-hearted sister, to pay for the warmth of his survival. It would have been almost poetic if it weren't so exhausting. When I walked into his room, the smell of antiseptic hit me first, sharp, clean, unforgiving. Ethan looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken into a tangle of wires and tape, his face pale under the bruises, his mouth slightly open as if still forming the excuses that used to pour from it. Machines kept rhythm where his charm once did. Maya sat in a chair beside him, mascara smudged in rivers down her cheeks, holding his limp hand like a child clutching a broken toy. When she saw me, she started to speak but stopped halfway through my name, the rest of it dissolving into guilt. I didn't need her to say anything. Some silences explain themselves. The doctor entered, young enough to believe in fairness, and explained the situation with professional detachment. There was internal damage, complications, and limited time. Ethan needed immediate surgery, but their insurance had lapsed during a transition period, the kind of bureaucratic gap only carelessness could produce. The estimated cost was a number large enough to build a new life from. The doctor, mistaking my quiet for hesitation, said gently that families sometimes come together at moments like this, that forgiveness can be a form of healing. I thanked him, because he was kind, and because he had no idea that forgiveness had already been mortgaged to pay for other people's convenience. In the hallway, my mother took my hand and said, "Hannah, you're his sister. He made mistakes, but blood is blood." And I thought about all the times blood had been used as an invoice, the way it's supposed to cover overdrafts of decency, and how, over the years, I had learned that love in our family often came stapled to debt. I told her softly that I understood, that I would think about it, which was true, because I did think about it on the long walk to my car, through the echoing parking garage, under the orange glow of lights that never quite reached the corners. I thought about the nights I had lain awake recalculating other people's errors, about the bank accounts drained under my name, the whispers behind closed doors, the family dinners where I was treated as the problem simply because I refused to pretend. I thought about karma, not as a cosmic vending machine that delivers justice on demand, but as something slower, more deliberate, that walks barefoot through time and eventually arrives exactly where it's owed. And as I started the car, I realized this was it. This was karma's bill being slid quietly across the table, my name written neatly in the corner, and for once I was under no obligation to sign. The next morning, I received a voicemail from the hospital administrator, polite and practiced, explaining that without payment authorization they would have to delay the surgery until a financial guarantee was secured. My father called moments later, his voice stripped of authority, asking if I could just help this once. I listened, not because I owed him, but because old habits die the way stars die, slowly and in silence. When he finished, I told him something I had not said out loud before, that helping someone who never learned from consequences was not kindness, it was cruelty disguised as compassion. He said nothing. The line went quiet, then ended with a small click of resignation. That evening, I drove back to the hospital. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and recycled air. Maya was there, mascara gone, voice flat from exhaustion. She stood as I entered, hopeful again, the way people are when they think mercy is contagious. I looked past her, through the glass, at Ethan, motionless except for the steady rise and fall of a machine that had more loyalty than he ever showed anyone, and I finally spoke. I told her that sometimes, when a debt grows too large, paying it only teaches the debtor that ruin is temporary. I told her I hoped he survived, but that I would not save him. Then I turned to leave, and in the quiet behind me, I heard her sob once, softly, like a confession. Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain, the kind that doesn't cleanse but remembers. I stood there for a moment, letting the air cool the heat in my chest, and realized that the story I had been living was finally changing shape. For years, I had been the one left to clean, to fix, to fund, to explain. But not tonight. Tonight, I was simply the one who left the bill where it belonged. The morning after I left the waiting room with my dignity and without a receipt, the sun rose with the kind of indifferent brightness that feels like an accusation, and I made coffee while the house settled around me. A house that had learned the new choreography of one toothbrush, one set of keys, and one voice that did not need to rehearse apologies, and as the kettle hissed, I opened the folder that had started this entire sober march toward clarity, the folder of taxes and other things that hurt, and I laid out, the way a careful dealer lays cards for a table that has finally agreed to play by rules, the titles to a vintage boat and a classic car Ethan loved to polish and post, the closed but not forgotten accounts tied to his old side ventures, the invoice from the unpermitted deck with the contractor's paid in cash note, and the email from Grace confirming a temporary pause that would become permanent if documentation did not arrive, and I understood with the kind of quiet. You do not brag about that. All the pieces for a clean ending were already here. They only needed someone unafraid of being called unkind to place them. The first call I made was not to the hospital or my parents. It was to the county clerk, where a woman with a voice like gravel and kindness typed faster than most people think, and I asked, purely as a citizen who reads, how one initiates a hospital lien in our state when a patient has attachable assets and no immediate guarantor, and she explained, pleasantly, that the hospital itself typically files, but that tip lines and asset lists arriving with public record citations have a way of speeding good paperwork along, so I sent the links, the VIN, the boat registration, and the HOA's notice of fines for the deck that would not pass inspection even on a forgiving day. And then I emailed the hospital's billing department a neat summary titled, Assets Potentially Available for Medical Lien, attaching nothing sensational, only facts with the right labels, because in a world drunk on drama, sobriety lands like thunder. The second call, measured and merciless in equal parts, went to the insurer, where I did not pose as a relative or attempt a backdoor trick. I simply asked for the published policy on lapses and retroactive reinstatement for emergencies. And when the agent confirmed what I already suspected, that reinstatement within a short window is possible with proof of continuous eligibility and payment of arrears, I forwarded that exact paragraph to Maya with a subject line that said, use this script and an opening sentence that would read to any auditor as compassionate while still sounding like a warning bell to anyone who prays to convenience, telling her to ask, precisely, for reinstatement conditioned on immediate payment pulled from Ethan's own accounts, and to authorize the carrier to recover from property through lien if the checking account could not sustain the arrears. And I did this not because I wanted to save them, but because I wanted cause and effect to finally stop making small talk and shake hands like grown-ups. By noon my parents were calling in a duet of hope and frustration, my mother deploying the well-worn chorus about family and mercy, while my father, newly fluent in the language of consequences, asked in a smaller voice whether there was perhaps a way to structure this, and I told them there was, that it was already underway, that the hospital had what it needed to be paid without an advance from me, and that, out of respect for everyone's blood pressure, they should stop calling me the bank. Because the bank had already been notified and was delightfully good at its job, and my mother said I was being dramatic, which made me laugh in the soft, tired way that furniture laughs when it finally gets moved to the right room. When I went back that evening, the hospital smelled the way hospitals always smell, like lemon and electricity, and I found Ethan propped at an angle that made him look like a boy caught mid-excuse. Except the machines were doing all the talking and the story they told was simple, stable for now, surgery scheduled, consent obtained by a wife who could sign for an adult who had never quite grown up. And I stood at the foot of the bed and took in the bruises and the stitches and the terrible softness that follows a hard night, and for a moment I felt the old reflex rising, the one that wants to rearrange itself into a cushion for someone else's fall. And then I thought of every invoice that had ever arrived stamped past due, because I had been assigned the role of safety net without audition, and the reflex stepped back the way a tide steps back when it finally meets a seawall. Maya looked at me with eyes that had been crying longer than mascara was designed for and whispered that somehow, with paperwork magic, the hospital had received payment authorization pending asset verification. And I watched the realization move across her face like weather, because what she meant was not magic at all, it was arithmetic with teeth, and she asked if I had paid, and I told her the truth, that I had paid with time and with reading, that I had delivered a bill to its rightful owner, and that if she wanted to thank someone she should send flowers to the county clerk. Ethan stirred then, long enough to see me, to register the absence of a cape and the presence of consequence, and he tried to form the words he had always leaned on: sorry, help, later, and what came out instead was a smaller sentence: you won. To which I answered with a softness I had earned: no, I did not win, karma did, I only held the door. At the billing desk, the administrator repeated the question that had followed me through the day: who would be responsible if assets did not cover the remainder? And I signed nothing. I handed over no card. I smiled the kind of smile that is not cruel but instructed, and said the line that had been waiting since the night of the casserole: funny how karma sends the bill to the right address. Then I set down a single sheet for their file, the notarized revocation that removed my name from all guarantees, and I left it there like a lighthouse in a fog others preferred to pretend was romance. I walked out into a night that was not merciful and not mean, just honest, a night that smelled faintly of rain and parking lot, and while the automatic doors sighed behind me, I let myself picture, for one brief, disobedient second, the other ending. The one where I swipe a card, carry a debt, reassure a family that has never once returned the favor, and I felt the tug of it, because I am not a statue. I am a woman who remembers birthdays and recipes, and the children we once planned but never had. Yet, even inside that tug lived a quieter knowledge that paying would have only bought more of the same, and I had finally decided that the same was a luxury I could no longer afford. Weeks later, when the invoices sprouted like weeds and the liens rooted where they were planted and the boat and the car changed hands to owners who had not mistaken shine for substance, I received a small, unmarked card in the mail with a handwriting I did not recognize and a single sentence that might have been gratitude or might have been surrender. We're covered for now, and I tucked it into the back of the folder with all the other things that once hurt. And I made dinner for one without ceremony, and I listened to a house that no longer argued with itself, and I decided, with a peace that did not ask permission, that the mystery of whether I had slipped a check under the door would remain a mystery. Because some endings are strongest when they decline to explain themselves, and some revenges are sweetest when the audience is left just close enough to the truth to feel it breathing.